Sorry, I turned it off instead of unmuting. Sound better? Y'all hear me in the headphones? Can you hear me in the headphones, Cordell? I guess not. Can you hear me in the headphones? Yeah. No sound in the headphones? No sound in the headphones? I'll have to troubleshoot those separately. So, it's become a tradition of ours to have some sound system problems every now and then. We're all kind of do-it-yourselfers in that regard. In my experience, I've done a lot of PA stuff and guitar amps, but that's usually pretty high volume music and not necessarily, this type setting. So Wednesday looks like our microphone, the receiver for these two microphones died completely, won't power off. So we got lapel mics for a stopgap today. I'm wearing one lapel mic. We got one fixtured here. That's what I was trying to test earlier. Problem is, these is all supposed to have a range about this far. To have a range for this far, you got to boost up the sensitivity so high that it starts picking up all sorts of other noise. We're going to have a bit of a stopgap system in place today. You'll be able to hear the speaker pretty well, but for others using the podium, we got to make sure that we project really well, speak clearly, pretend like we don't even have a microphone. Ms. James should be able to hear me crystal clear with or without a microphone. That's the thing that you got to use, project your voice. Anyways, let's get to our Bible class. This is on lesson number 12 on teachability. Handouts for last week. I haven't had time to put together handouts for next week, our final class. But does anybody need a handout for this morning on teachability? Morning. Also want to ask everybody's patience this morning, kind of getting over being under the weather, so I'm a little bit coffee or anything, or I start losing my voice, bear with me. Might ask for some help reading some passages this morning, depending on how my voice is doing. So we're going to be studying teachability. This is the next to last lesson in our series on qualities of leadership found in the Bible. And again, want to emphasize this, when we talk about leadership, we aren't talking about anybody that wants to be a manager or an elder or other types of secular or church leadership positions. Anybody who is an influence could be a leader. Leadership is basically using your influence for good. So when we talk about different qualities, a lot of these qualities we've talked about is kind of obvious after you look at it why it's a leadership characteristic. But teachability, why do we want to study teachability to be a better spiritual leader? Don't we just want the people we're influencing to be teachable? Shouldn't a leader know it all already? Why should a leadership type figure be teachable? Well, let's start talking about that. Kara? Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Kara says, with teachability comes humility. Donnie? Yeah, and that's a good question. Yep. So, there's been, somebody might say, well, why should I listen to them? They don't know everything. Well, a leader has to be humble, has to recognize that they don't know everything, that they could always keep learning. And if you aren't teachable in a spiritual sense, you'll never go from the spiritual milk to the spiritual solid food and progress and mature. So you always have to be humble. You always have to recognize you don't know everything. You all heard the phrase, when you're through learning, you're through? I think a lot of different people have said that, but think about that. When you're through learning, you're through. So if there's nothing left to learn, you're going to, if you think there's nothing left to learn, you're going to get yourself into a tough position one day and get humbled the hard way. So we never arrive at a position where you know everything. You never complete your learning. There is always further to go with our understanding. And also, if we want to keep people we're trying to influence or people we're trying to lead continuously moving forward, we, as leaders and influencers, grow. And if we grow, we have to learn. And if we want to learn, we have to remain teachable. So if we want to continue learning and growing, what are some ways that we should want to be taught? What are some ways we should continue to grow spiritually? What are some spiritual growth goals or spiritual learning goals?
I think we need to realize the Bible was designed in such a way that every time we open it, we learn something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good answer. Bill says the Bible, every time we open it, there's something new to learn. We're never going to stop learning about the Bible. We could learn, from the same passage, we could learn a half dozen different lessons and different applications. And as we go through life, we have different experiences. You might go through something next week that you never went through in all the years of your life before. A new challenge, new something to learn. Brandon, did you have your hand up also? Mhm. More discipline. Yeah, that's a great aspect. Because, talking about discipline, the problem isn't always knowing right and wrong, it's having the discipline to do the right thing, right? And so you might know the facts of right and wrong, but then there's more learning on how to do right and wrong, how to withstand temptation of the wrong, how to have the discipline to do what's right. So those are good points, guys. Appreciate it. So the enemy never rests. The enemy never gets to a place where it says, I'm as dangerous as I'm going to be. Not to get any more dangerous, I'm going to rest. The enemy never rests. So neither should we. We should never get to a place where we say, I've learned all I need to know. I don't need to be teachable again. Because what else would that imply on influence? If you're trying to influence people and you say, well, I've gotten there, that's going to show a bit of complacency. Like you get somewhere and then you just quit trying and you coast. It's kind of like the stereotype of somebody who makes supervisor, then just instead of working, watches everybody else work. I'm sure everybody's experienced that kind of negative stereotype. The book says, to be teachable, leaders must not only accept the discomfort of learning process, they must seek it. So learning could be uncomfortable sometimes, right? The book says we must seek the discomfort of learning. In what ways could learning be uncomfortable, do you think? And be challenged? Going back to Kara's point about humility, you might hear things that you don't want to hear. You might have to take your ego down a few notches if you're learning something about yourself personally or what you've done. Learning from what you've done, what you need to do different in the future. Discomfort, sometimes you got to prioritize, learning over other things that might be more immediately enjoyable. Prioritizing studying the Bible instead of doing whatever else with your time. Carrie, you have your hand up. Yeah, and that's some pretty good insight. One of the uncomfortable things about learning, to paraphrase Kara, is you gotta open yourself up to other people knowing about your weaknesses too. That's a good insight. Larry?
Sometimes we just make things entirely too complicated. As your example in your lesson here tonight, I mean, he could not understand how simple it was to do his lesson. It had to be some big, elaborate, loaded, redundant thing. But really, it was simple. Sometimes we overcomplicate things.
Well,
And if we learn, then sometimes wisdom will show you a lot easier and more simpler way of doing things when you're trying to do it.
yeah, and that's a good point too. To paraphrase Larry's point, well, we humans tend to overcomplicate things. We get away from simplicity. One of the challenges of learning is sometimes you got to, again, goes back to pride. Take a step back, do something more simpler, and not something more ornate or fancy like Naaman. We'll get to his case study in a minute. You think, why should I do something that simple and easy? So, one of the things it says in the book is it's impossible to grow without feeling foolish and making mistakes. I don't know how exactly to phrase this. I hope I could set an example of being willing to be up here by letting everybody hear my voice crack when I'm leading singing, and when I mix up verses, and when I mispronounce words and names in the Bible. I hope all the goofs I make publicly encourage people that it's okay to get up here and make a goof also. Here it's impossible to grow without feeling foolish and making mistakes. So I use that as a silly example. But if we want to grow, you gotta get out there. If you want to be teachable, you got to be willing to be challenged and have some critical feedback. And one final example from some of my work history. Not long after I started with my current company, working in a forging shop, me and one of the technicians I was working with were arguing about a way to fix a machine. Yeah, I thought I was right. He thought I was wrong, and I persisted, and he was right. And we made a spare part. We started it up, and it didn't last 2 seconds before it crashed. And I don't know if you've ever seen a forge crash before, but it's not pretty, and it's going to be another, day to fix it. So he was right. I was wrong. I didn't listen in my pride. I tried to go and pull rank, and I was wrong, and I had to go and report out what happened. Turns out that guy, it turned out to be one of my coworkers, learned a lot from him. And when we closed the plant in South Carolina, we were just about. So I learned a lot from that experience about, swallow your pride, listen to others, avoid big mistakes. And, it was a humbling moment for me. And I think about that often when we have, troubleshooting discussion in the plants about, are we going based off of ego, or are we going based off of reasoning and experience? So you got to be humble if you're going to be willing to learn. So let's turn to the book of Daniel, and let's get into our case studies. Let's talk about Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll start our case studies with a negative example from the Old Testament. So the book of Daniel. I have a hard time finding books and talking at the same time, even more so when we're talking about the middle of the Old Testament. So let's read this narrative together about King Nebuchadnezzar. So at this point, Daniel chapter 4, I'm going to start in verse 13. Nebuchadnezzar, I think we're familiar with that figure. He opened up to Daniel and his friends after he saw the experience in the lion's den, and Daniel interpreted some of his dreams. So picking up in verse 13, this is Nebuchadnezzar narrating one of his dream experiences. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a holy one came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. And so on. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about a tree being cut down into a stump but being bound up. And then skipping down to verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar calls Daniel to help interpret it. In verse 19, Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And carrying on, down in verse 25, Daniel continues the explanation. You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives to whom he will. So the interpretation of the dream is Nebuchadnezzar is a tree. He will be. Why? Daniel also explains it is basically to humble him, so that he would know that the true God rules, and not the worldly things. It should be a humbling lesson, Nebuchadnezzar. It is a lesson about how he needs to recognize the true divinity of God. He needs to give God the credit. He needs to get away from the pagan idolatry that they're surrounded by. But does Nebuchadnezzar, is he teachable, and does he listen to this lesson? Let's read his reaction. Verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered, and he said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty? Well, that's not very humble, is it? It says, look at all these things that I have built for my glory. Well, verse 31. While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men, and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. So basically, because of his pride, and because Nebuchadnezzar failed to learn the lesson that God wanted him to learn, sent to him in a dream and interpreted by Daniel, he was basically driven insane and driven into the wild to live like an animal. So, let's turn to our questions. Question 1, what do you believe would have happened if Nebuchadnezzar had been teachable, and for 12 months? The story could have been different, right? How would it be different? What was that, Larry?
God's wrath may have been turned away from him, and left him king, but he would have been a more humble king and realized that one day a whole lot higher the source in prepared.
Right.
That's kind of what we get into with all this stuff going back and forth now. We have to realize that no matter what, God is still in charge. He's going to put in charge whoever he wants to be in charge.
All right. So it could have been a lot different. So to Larry's point, God's wrath against Nebuchadnezzar could have been avoided. He could have been left king. He could have been more of a spiritual leader also. Nebuchadnezzar was a physical king. He gave himself the glory. He tried to give himself the divine credit instead of giving God the glory and the credit. His prosperity could have been continued. This lesson in the wilderness could have been avoided. But think about, Nebuchadnezzar could have been a spiritual leader for the true God. Things could have been entirely different. There could have been the spread of the true belief in Jehovah in other parts of the world. Faith could have been spread if he had repented, if he had humbled himself, but unfortunately he learned his hard way. So question 2, how would you describe Nebuchadnezzar's attitude and personality before the prophecy was fulfilled? How did he think of himself? Prideful, very prideful. Yeah. So Betty says he thought he was in charge of everything. Now, when you say everything, do you mean his kingdom or? Right. Yep. Yeah, and thanks for expanding on that. I think you saw where I was going. He thought he was in charge of everything, but not just the physical day in, day out stuff, but he thought he was in charge of the overall. It was because of his special power, you know. Um, he thought he was in charge of like the bigger picture and influencing something through some, supernatural powers that he had. He had been previously humble enough to acknowledge God with his encounters with Daniel, but not humble enough to live by it, not humble enough to change his thinking or anything like that. Also, I'd say that he thought about God as a source of divine material things only and not anything spiritual. Thought that the God of Daniel would have given him material things just for enjoyment and neglecting any of the bigger picture things about the God of Daniel. So let's read the aftermath. Let's pick up again Daniel 4, verses 34, and read what happens next. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will, according to the hosts of heaven, and among the inhabitants of earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of thy kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my Lord sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the kingdom of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So question 3, how would you describe Nebuchadnezzar was restored? Who would like to describe Nebuchadnezzar's change in heart? He's in reality now. What kind of reality is he seeing? That's a good way to start. So he's seeing the reality of who's in control. Larry? He's learned humility now, hasn't he? Yep. Yep. Take the wind out of your sails. You got to have learn a few lessons the hard way sometimes, don't you? Mm. Oh yeah. Yeah. I like how Bill phrased that. He says that happens to Christians too. Sometimes we got to get a smack in the face to get humble. Not a literal smack, but reality is going to come up and hit you sometimes, and you say, man, I was pretty blind to that, and now I see the ways. So good. Any more discussion on Nebuchadnezzar before we turn to Naaman? Appreciate everybody's comments. I'm going to try and keep my coughing reserved for about 19 more minutes. Let's turn to chapter 2 Kings, chapter 5. We aren't going to read this entire passage. I think we should be pretty familiar with this passage. So to summarize it really quick. So Naaman is the commander in the army of King Aram. And Aram, with a lot of his victories before, so he's a military commander. In this case, he comes down with leprosy. Which, remember, at the time, leprosy is basically a disease that you have to go and isolate from. You're considered unclean in multiple cultures, not just the Israelite culture. But since it had no cure and it was contagious, you basically had to be quarantined for life. So Naaman, his wife has a Israelite servant who says, well, there's prophets in Israel that could go and heal you of this. So the king of Syria gives Naaman permission, go to Israel, go search out the king, and go find a cure. So Naaman, what's he told to do? Help me narrate this story. When Naaman goes to Israel, he's looking for Elisha. And then what happens there? Does Elisha come out to greet him face to face? Elisha sends a servant to greet Naaman. Naaman is affronted by this. Naaman is told by the messenger to go and bathe in the river Jordan. He's affronted by that again. He finally obeys and he's healed. So we're going to, without reading the whole passage, let's go to the study questions for the sake of time. So Naaman, he listened to the advice of the young girl that served his wife, the Israelite servant of his wife. What does this tell you about Naaman, that he was willing to listen to that Israelite servant of his wife? He was desperate for a cure. Yep. So that's a good way to put it. Larry says that he was desperate. Why? Because the disease is terrible. And what indicates his desperation? Well, if you have a military commander who takes advice from the captured prisoner of war servant from what they see in the lesser culture. Well, I'm sorry? And female too. So there's a lot of, that shows that they bridge some cultural differences and cultural conflicts. So he was desperate. In his desperation, he was teachable. So he was open-minded enough to listen to this advice and be curious and to go and investigate it. He was reasonable and practical. That's what Kent says. So reasonable and practical enough to set aside any sort of prejudice and go and investigate and see what all there is to this. So question 2, when the king of Aram sent Naaman to the king of Israel to be healed, what do you think the Aramean king's motives were? We might need to read this. Yeah, I think a bit of intimidation, right? So we're saying the king says, well, if I'm going to send my general on the advice of a servant girl of a lesser culture, I'm going to write a letter to the king of that lesser culture, make sure they know who's boss. Just because we're getting help from you doesn't mean that anything's going to change. This is what the letter said. If you look at 2 Kings 5, verse 6, and he, Naaman, brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. So you could kind of see on a king-to-king level a little bit of intimidation here. It wasn't really a personal matter at this time. It was, well, if one of my guys needs help, we're going to make sure that the guy who's helping him isn't, getting big-headed or anything. We're going to take advantage about it. I think, too, he might have been curious about any, what he might perceive as magic power of the Israelite God. Again, being in a pagan environment, thinking, well, I wonder if the Israelite God could do anything that we could take advantage of, control. You know, excuse me. So question 3, why did Naaman react angrily when the messenger gave him Elisha's instructions? I mentioned that previously, but let's have somebody explain. Why was Naaman angry when the messenger gave him the instructions?
Basically, Elisha just act like he really didn't care. He just sent a messenger out. Hey, go to him 7 times, River Jordan, you'll be fine.
Mm.
Even here, he's a big leader, commander, all these people. I think he needs to have a little more prestige, a little bit more respect.
Yeah. Naaman thought he was being brushed off, didn't he? Says, go wash in this muddy river. Naaman, being the general of the conquering people, would say, I deserve more respect than that. I deserve y'all to send out a parade to greet me, not just a single messenger. I expect this mighty prophet Elisha or the king to come out and greet me, not this messenger. I expect y'all to prepare, if I got to wash, prepare a fountain or a fancy bath or marble or something like that. So he was definitely, slighted. He thought he was getting the inferior treatment. So, what does that show about his teachability and how that's changed? Yep. So he was prideful. And you had another comment, Larry?
Well, I was going to say one good thing about Naaman, he was willing to listen to people under him.
Yep. He started that way. So let's trace his progression. He started off willing to listen to his wife's servant. His king was on board. He sent him with a letter. But then all of a sudden, when Elisha is greeted by when Naaman is greeted by Elisha, he's teachability, right? So now he's become prideful. Do you think the letter that the king sent with him had any influence on that? Saying, here's the king, I'm sending my general, don't forget your place, Israel. I think he might have gotten a little bit headed carrying around that letter, thinking, well, I'm coming here with the permission of the king. I'm not going to let these Israelites act like they're better than me. So I think he lost his teachability because he let that pride take over. He had the king's letter behind him. So let's think about ourselves. Do we ever follow that same progression? Do we ever start where we are teachable as leaders, and then we have a reminder about our authority or our influence or our responsibilities, and then our pride takes over and we lose our teachability? Is that something that we could relate to? Sorry. So I think that's a danger that we could all encounter, both, in the church setting and outside of the church setting. If anybody has a change in status, let's say that somebody becomes one of the leaders of the church, somebody becomes elder. Well, I'm no longer going to help clean up after fellowship meal, I'm no longer going to go listen to feedback from other people. I'm no longer going to take any sort of ideas. I'm not going to listen to those ideas. Same thing in a work environment. Somebody progresses to another level of responsibility. Well, I'm not going to go take any input from those people anymore. I don't work with them anymore. I'm in a different team. Got to make sure we don't lose our teachability if we let pride take over in our lives. Any other comments on Naaman before we turn to our third and final case study? Pride goes before the fall. What Kent said. So, very true. Pride is one of those first ingredients in a bigger problem down. All right, so let's turn to our final case study in the book of Mark today. Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 17. As he was setting out on his journey, as Jesus was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." And he said to him, "Teacher, all these things I have kept from my youth." And Jesus, looking at him, loved him. And let's pause right there and go to our first question. So, familiar passage for us. Let's pause. Question 1 says, if you had read this passage and stopped at the point where you looked at the man, what would you think about the man who asked a question? You considered him to be open and teachable at this point. So let's not think about the rest of it, but just the impression of the man. What's your impressions of this man so far in his question to Jesus? Mm-hmm. Yep. He started off pretty good, didn't he? He started off asking the right question. It looks like he's willing, but at the same time, he knows that there's something that he needs to do. It looks like he's pretty teachable so far. So looking for confirmation, to paraphrase Ken's point, looking for confirmation, kind of looking for anything else he needs to do, but also kind of hoping that he's good right now. Yeah, that's an interesting point too. Excuse me. About 5 minutes left. All right, let's pick up where we left off. Verse 21, and Jesus, looking at him, loved him, and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and go give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come, follow me." Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of heaven." And the disciples were amazed at his words. But Jesus said to them again, "Children, how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And they were exceedingly astonished and said to him, "Then who can be saved?" Jesus looked at them and said, "With man it is impossible, but not with God. For all things are possible with God." So question number 2. So what about after, how does our view of the man change after Jesus told him to go sell everything, give to the poor, and follow him? and then he walks away sorrowful. Now how do we see him? Seeing his reaction to that teaching. I would say he was selectively teachable. In the beginning, it looks like he was teachable, asking Jesus a question. But then afterwards, sounds like he had a lesson that he didn't want to learn. Donnie, did you have your hand going up? Okay, sorry. So, selective teachability, is that a challenge that we face? Are there certain things that we'd rather kind of turn a blind eye to and avoid any feedback about certain things? You know, it's tough to take feedback, knowing that we aren't perfect and we all make mistakes. There's always going to be some blemishes to work that we do. There's always going to be some things that we struggle with. Sometimes we'd rather have things that we just live with the struggle instead of the struggle to overcome it. Any thoughts on that? Now you've got your hand up. And what's that? What's that? Covetousness. That's a good point. Yep, and that's a good point. You know, talking about covetousness is a lesson he didn't want to learn. So question 3, what was a real issue for him? You know, his wealth, his goods, did that make him unteachable for certain things? Some things get in the way and you don't want to learn it. Right. That is very true. You know, to boil up Kent's point, people resist change. It's really hard to hear feedback about what change you need to make. I randomly had a song lyric pop into my head. I don't know if y'all know, it's like a 1970 song by Fleetwood Mac, where one of the lyrics is, "Don't ask me what I think of you. You might not like the answer I give to you." Something along those lines. But it's hard to take feedback a lot of the time, so we got to approach that with a humble heart, knowing that the ultimate purpose isn't to go and say who's right and who's wrong, but what can we all do better to serve the Lord, or what can we all do better to get to heaven together. So our time is up this morning. I appreciate y'all's patience, both with the sound system and, you know, with me for a bit of illness. So next week, I have handouts made yet, but I'll see if I could get those to you today or Wednesday about the final class in the lesson about leadership vision. We're not talking about your quality of eyesight. We're talking about vision for the future and the role that plays in our leadership and our influence on others. Appreciate the class, everybody, today. Thank you.